Welcome to the Eden Woolley House, home of the Ocean Township Historical Museum. I'm Peggy Dellinger, the museum's exhibit director. We're here in the Richmond Gallery of the Eden Woolley House. This is the space we use for a major changing exhibit that changes about once a year. The current exhibit is the Presidents at the Monmouth County Shore, and it's about to change. And before it's gone forever, we wanted to share it with you and put it on record so that we can remember how it looked and continue to learn from it. Before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge the Long Branch Historical Museum Association for sharing with us some of their national treasures that we'll be introduced to shortly. When we began our research, we thought by our count there were 13 U.S. presidents who visited the Monmouth County Shore, but since we've had the exhibit up, we have had visitors who've had firsthand and family accounts that there are at least two others, including Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower. So let's say 13, give or take, maybe 15 presidents visited Monmouth County Shore. Many of us know about those that visited Long Branch, but this exhibit also covers the presidents who visited Asbury Park, Ocean Grove, Seagirt. So however you count them, 13, 15, give or take one or two, we have had a significant number of our 45 presidents come here to the Monmouth County Shore, and we focus a lot on Long Branch. Many of us know about Long Branch and the 7 presidents we count who visited and summered here. But we also talk about Asbury Park, Ocean Grove, and Seagirt. The question that I found most fascinating in researching for the exhibit is why? Why Monmouth County? Why Long Branch? Why Asbury Park? Of all the places that our presidents could have come to vacation, why did they choose us? The answer has a lot to do with Long Branch. Long Branch was already a thriving resort, coastal resort. It had wonderful big old wooden hotels, 4 stories high, block long, each floor with a veranda along it facing the ocean, where visitors would come with their large trunks and stay for weeks, perhaps even for the season. There were several events that made Long Branch much more popular than it had been, that really put it on the map. And one was that the President of the United States' wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, came here in 1861. Her husband, Abraham, was in Washington. It was right after the Battle of Bull Run, which hadn't gone well for the North, and President Lincoln was reluctant to leave the capital. But Mary Lincoln came here and was put up at one of the Grand Hotels and was treated like American royalty with parties and balls and demonstrations of the life-saving service. And while all this was going on, the newspapers from across the country were reporting her every move. And Long Branch became very familiar to people all over the country. By our account, at least 100 newspapers were carrying this story and making Long Branch the place to be. At the same time, there was a significant invention in the mid-19th century that made it possible to get to Long Branch with a lot more comfort and ease than had been previously possible. The steam engine, making rail travel feasible and steamboat travel comfortable and feasible, changed everything. Because before that, to escape the oppressive heat of the cities in those Victorian times, when women were corseted and covered with long-sleeved, long-necked dresses even in the heat of August, you had to take a horse and buggy. It was long, it was uncomfortable, and it was impractical. But with the steam engine and the railroad travel to Long Branch, and at first to Sandy Hook and later directly to Long Branch, the city became accessible and much more attractive. So we have Mary Lincoln's visit and the steam engine putting Long Branch on the map and making it a well-known and popular resort. So we know that a First Lady visited us here at the Jersey Shore, but the very first president who came was Ulysses Grant. And he was probably brought here by the recommendation of the Lincolns. Mary Todd Lincoln found it a very favorable and delightful place. He also had some very wealthy friends who had what we called cottages, but are really mansions, in the Elberon section of Long Branch, and I believe they probably enticed him to come here too. He came here the first summer of his first year as president in 1869, and he stayed at one of the Grand Hotels. They gave him a ball too. He is alleged to have said that he would rather lead his troops into another battle than withstand another dance. He wasn't particularly fond of dancing, but the rest of the things that Long Branch had to offer were right up his alley. Grant was a horseman, a superb horseman. He loved to take his carriage and his horse up and down Ocean Avenue, was alleged to have gone very fast, so fast that he was cautioned many times to slow down. He loved, we know, to smoke his cigars, unfortunately and tragically, the cause of his lung and his throat rather, and tongue cancer that killed him. He loved his drink, he loved to gamble. The first Monmouth racetrack, Monmouth Park, opened while he was vacationing here. He had a box season seat. He went there frequently and loved to bet on the horses. So Long Branch really suited his tastes and lifestyle. And this is in contrast to Asbury Park and Ocean Grove, which were established in the later part of the 1800s. Both were dry and were rather staid in their entertainment. No gambling, no wild nightlife, and no alcohol. So let's talk a little bit about Grant and what we have here in the exhibit to show you that is part of Grant's story. This marvelous old chair is one of the treasures that the Long Branch Historical Museum has shared with us. And it came from Grant's cottage. When I say Grant's cottage, I'm referring to a 28-room mansion on the bluff in the area that is just to the south of what is today Stella Maris on Ocean Avenue in Elberon. Grant and his family would sit on the veranda of their cottage, and tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of day trippers would come down by rail and visit Long Branch and stroll or take horse and buggy along Ocean Avenue in hopes of catching a glimpse of Grant and his family. We have to remember that in 1869 we were only 4 short years from the end of the Civil War, and that to a nation, or at least to the North, Ulysses Grant was not only president, he was the savior of the Union and a national hero. He was not a particularly skilled president. He trusted many people who did not deserve his trust, but he was beloved of his people. So it was a wonderful boon for the city of Long Branch to have President Grant vacationing there, and his friends, whom we mentioned earlier, who had perhaps been the ones who invited Grant to visit Long Branch initially, bought him this cottage on the bluff. And Grant returned there every summer, or nearly every summer, for the next 15 years, so even past his presidency. He started his autobiography there, but he actually was in New York State when he died. In this part of our exhibit, we show a picture of Grant's cottage. We show the horse, a little symbolic horse and buggy, just to indicate how much the president loved horses and loved to ride along Ocean Avenue, and I believe even along the beach. And if we sway over a little bit, we'll see the picture of another chair. And this chair, too, came from Grant's cottage. And there's a famous picture of President Grant and his family at their cottage. And in it, you see his oldest son, Jesse, sitting in what we believe to be the chair that we have on display here, thanks to the Long Branch Historical Museum. The last treasure we have here from President Grant is this wonderful game table, which again came from his cottage in Elberon and has been loaned to us by the Long Branch Historical Museum. We can just imagine Grant sitting there playing checkers or chess with his children. And I want to point out, too, that on the table are original first editions of his memoir. As I mentioned, Grant had put his faith as president in people who were not worthy of that confidence, and the same proved true in business. After his presidency, he went into business with a partner, and they had a Wall Street firm that took investments, and it turned out to be kind of the Bernie Madoff of its day, and a Ponzi scheme in which all of the investors lost their money, including Ulysses Grant. And President Grant was mortified for having betrayed, even unknowingly, the trust of the people who had loved and respected him. And on top of that, he was impoverished. He was dying of throat and tongue cancer, and he was trying to think of a way that he could provide for his family after he was gone. His friends encouraged him to write his memoir, particularly Mark Twain, who was also a visitor frequently at the Jersey Shore. And Mark Twain arranged for a publisher, and Grant sat down to write this 2-volume autobiography. He began it at the Cottage in Elberon. He finished it just before his death in New York State. And it turned out to be an immediate bestseller and did exactly what Grant had hoped, and that is provide for his family. The bulk of the 2 volumes talks about his reflections and his memories about the various battles of the Civil War, but it ends with a more generalized look back, and particularly Grant's reflections on what might have been had President Lincoln not been assassinated. The town fathers of Long Branch were a little concerned after Grant was no longer president, because they had enjoyed some very good times while he was here. They needn't have worried, because a whole succession of presidents followed Grant right to the Long Branch shore. And the next in line, right after President Grant, was Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes and his wife Lucy, who was known as Lemonade Lucy, were both non-drinkers. So, as we had mentioned, that Grant loved his cigars, loved his whiskey, loved to gamble, loved his horses. Hayes would have none of that. Lucy and Rutherford were guests at one of the hotels along the bluff in Long Branch, and we have here a little rocking chair on the mantle because we kind of depict them as rockers on the rocking chair on the porch, rockers, not swingers. And we have a typewriter and a telephone here because his was the first presidency to have a typewriter and a telephone in the White House. His telephone number was 1, and I believe it was connected directly to the Treasury. Hayes was our 19th president, and James Garfield was our 20th. And James Garfield, like Hayes and Grant before him, chose to vacation in Long Branch. But the Garfield story is definitely the most dramatic and certainly the most tragic of all of our president's stories. Garfield was familiar with the shore. He had vacationed for a summer in Ocean Grove while still a congressman. He was a brilliant man. He was perhaps the poorest of all of our presidents, had the humblest of beginnings, and yet he distinguished himself as an academic. He was sent to school as a teenager, and within 1 year of attending the school and working part-time as the school's janitor, he was invited to be on the faculty, and I believe taught mathematics and classical languages. He went on to graduate from Williams College. He was a distinguished general in the Civil War. He represented the state of Ohio in Congress. He was drafted by the Republican convention without his actively campaigning at all. When the convention could not decide on a candidate, Grant had entered the race again in hoping for another term, having had a term out during the Hayes presidency, rather. So the convention rallied, drafted Garfield, and Garfield ran. He chose Chester Arthur from New York City, to be his vice president, to gain the favor of the Republican political machine in New York. This becomes significant in light of what happened to Garfield. Garfield was an enlightened president, a gifted orator, a brilliant man, and probably would have been one of our great presidents. but we have no way of knowing because he was inaugurated in March, he was assassinated in July, and he died in September. And therein lies the story that connects us to him. When Garfield was shot, it was July, it was hot, it was Washington, D.C., and of all of the cities of the Northeast, Washington was perhaps the most uncomfortable and unhealthy, having been built on a swamp. It was mosquito infested. Apparently, the windows in the White House were never opened in the summer because the smell was so unpleasant. When Garfield was shot, they took the president to the White House to be treated. The story is that his doctor, who jealously guarded his care of the president and will allow no other doctors to examine him, was not a fan of the new theory of sterilization and was continually probing to find the bullets that were in Garfield's body, and in so doing infected the president until his whole body was riddled with septia, and the man was in excruciating pain, and the doctor would continually refuse to have any other opinions offered in the president's behalf. Finally, in desperation, Garfield and his wife, Lucretia, decided that they would take the president to Elberon. Lucretia had been in Elberon, so had the president earlier that summer. Lucretia herself was recovering from malaria and found that the fresh sea breezes of the Jersey Shore were very therapeutic and held out hope that the same might be true for the president. So in early September, they put the president on a specially equipped train with mattresses that would help to cushion the bumpy ride because the man was suffering in horrible pain. They brought him to the Elberon train station, and while he was traveling north, over 1,000 volunteers here in Elberon were working through the night to build an extension from the Elberon train station to the Franklin Cottage on the Long Branch shoreline, which was about, I think, 5/8 of a mile due east of the railroad station. The lantern on the table just depicts the volunteers who stood with lanterns to light the work of the men who labored through the night and successfully completed the railroad spur just as the train pulled into the station. The locomotive that had brought the president from Washington was too big and heavy for the small spur, so they changed locomotives. They transported the president, who otherwise would have had to travel by horse and buggy, to the Elberon Cottage, to the Franklin Cottage in Elberon, and installed the president with the big French doors open and the ocean air flowing in. At first, the president appeared to rally, but it was only a false hope, and within a few weeks, the president died. The president's body was transported using the same spur back to the Elberon station, and from Elberon back to Washington. And this flag that you see on the wall here, again on loan to us from the Long Branch Historical Museum, is another national treasure. The story is that before the president's body left Elberon, the people who were tending to him and the residents of Long Branch felt the urge to hold an impromptu memorial service honoring the president. And they looked for a flag, and they took this one down, I think, from a Masonic temple in Long Branch, and draped it over the president's casket and held their memorial service. And then the flag was removed and restored to its original place, and the president took his journey on to Washington, D.C. One last footnote to this story that's kind of interesting. There was a young Ocean Township student whose name, I'm going to walk into the camera to look at his name again, was Bruce Frankel, who was only 12 years old when he successfully completed a 4-year campaign to raise the money to put a marker in front of the Franklin Cottage, which burned down, no longer there, but the site of the Franklin Cottage on Garfield Place in Elberon. So we can now mark the place. Any passerby can see where our president died, thanks to the determination and commitment and hard work of young Bruce Frankel, no longer young. I mentioned that when James Garfield was running for president, he had recruited Chester Arthur to be his vice president because he needed the support of the Republican political machine in New York State. Chester Arthur was known to be a product of what we call the spoils system. He was what we might even call a political hack. And the nation woke up the day after James Garfield died to have Chester Arthur as their president. I think the only person more shocked than the American public was Chester Arthur himself, who was somewhat overcome by the responsibility he had inherited. Chester Arthur was renting a home in Elberon, had been to see President Garfield, had returned to his apartment in New York, believing that the president was doing better. He got a knock on the door in the middle of the night. It was the Supreme Court Justice who was there to swear him in as president. Arthur was in shock for a few days, but he did assume the responsibilities and the role of president and performed better than anyone had hoped that he could. And ironically and gratefully, he did more than almost anyone else to end the spoils system that had created him. So he was a decent president. He didn't get a second term, but we can remember him fondly. Chester Arthur was followed by Grover Cleveland. We have no evidence that Grover Cleveland was here at the Monmouth County Shore, so he's not included in our exhibit. But following Grover Cleveland was Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of a president. Benjamin Harrison I believe Benjamin Harrison came to the Jersey Shore to vacation, but it was Cape May. I believe he had a home in Cape May. But we have evidence that he came to us at the shore in Monmouth County because he spoke in Deal. And we have this guest book from the Elberon Beach Club. And for the day of July 4th, 1898, we have boldly written Benjamin Harrison's signature so that we have tangible evidence that he was here. And again, I want to acknowledge the Long Branch Historical Museum for loaning us this Elberon Beach Club log that has the president's signature in it. Benjamin Harrison was followed by Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland was a two-term president, but his terms were interrupted by the term of Benjamin Harrison. As I said, Cleveland wasn't here, he's not included, but following his presidency, we have William McKinley, and William McKinley was here. He vacationed here, and he was probably drawn here by his first vice president. McKinley was elected to a second term, assassinated very shortly into that second term, but his vice president for his first term was a man named Garrett Hobart of West Long Branch. Garrett Hobart was living in West Long Branch. He had he rented a large, beautiful home that has since burned down. It's on the site of the Guggenheim Library of the Monmouth University campus. And we have every reason to believe that McKinley visited him there, perhaps stayed overnight there. But it is the Hobart connection that's particularly fascinating. And that's even more so in light of McKinley's assassination, because Hobart died of kidney disease late in McKinley's first term. Otherwise, we have every reason to assume that he would have run with McKinley for his successful election to a second term and would have been the vice president when McKinley was shot. And therefore, we would have had a president from West Long Branch. But we all know that didn't happen. After Hobart's death, McKinley chose Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president, and so we have President Teddy Roosevelt. McKinley was our 25th president, and we skip a few presidents before we have one returning to us here. And that would be Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, and the first Democrat in our story. Woodrow Wilson has a strong connection to New Jersey. He's a Southern boy. He was born and brought up in the South, which is an important fact because of some of his beliefs and prejudices. But he also came to New Jersey as a student at Princeton University. He was later president of Princeton University, and he was convinced to run for the governorship of New Jersey by people who were influential movers and shakers, one of whom lived right here in Ocean Township, Colonel George Harvey. George Harvey convinced Wilson to run for the Democratic nomination for the governor of New Jersey. He won that, and he won the governorship and served in that capacity until the same George Harvey convinced him that he should try a run for president, which he did and was successful in that. And during those times when he was the governor would leave Trenton in the heat and the oppressive humidity of summer and come to Seagirt, where we had a National Guard installation, still do, and that would be the site of the summer capital for New Jersey governors. So Wilson was a frequent visitor and vacationer at the Jersey Shore, and that didn't change when he became president. When he was notified of his first nomination by the Democrats, he was in Seagirt. When he was notified of the nomination to run for a second term, he was staying at Shadow Lawn, a building that has since burned down and is now Wilson Hall on the Monmouth University campus. In that day, the candidate didn't go to the convention. They had an elaborate and official notification celebration called Notification Day, and Wilson entertained tens of thousands of people on the Shadow Lawn estate who came to see his official acceptance of his nomination. This desk is actually Wilson's desk, again on loan to us from the Long Branch Historical Museum. It sat in his campaign office, which was in the building which held Fish Restaurant most recently, I believe, in Asbury Park, and it was on the 5th floor, and Wilson conducted his business of president from Shadow Lawn in West Long Branch, but his business of candidate from Asbury Park in his campaign offices, sitting at this very desk. We also have a letter from the caretaker, from Wilson, hand-signed letter from Wilson to the caretaker of Shadow Lawn, because it was the custom in this day for the candidate not to go on the stump, but to stay put, and for the people to come from the States to visit him. So tens of thousands of people came over the few months of the campaign and pretty much trashed the lawns at Shadow Lawn. And so the job of the groundskeeper was a difficult one during those days. So Wilson was acknowledging that in this letter, and the grandson of that groundskeeper, who is his namesake, has loaned us this letter for the course of this exhibit. Wilson served 2 terms as president, and he was followed by one of the men who makes the top 10 list of our worst presidents. By his own admission, he was in over his head, and that would be Warren Harding. We've now left our stories of Long Branch. Wilson's really technically West Long Branch, but our Long Branch stories, and we've moved on to Asbury Park. And our President Harding's connection to Asbury Park is a notorious one. He was a handsome man. A lot of people say that his strongest qualification for being president was that he looked and sounded presidential. His term was one that was scandal-ridden. The famous Teapot Dome scandal was one that comes to mind. But the scandal that perhaps didn't make the news at the time but was unearthed post his death, that he was a president who also died in office, this time of illness, or it was alleged food poisoning, perhaps by his wife, but that has been discounted in recent years. But President Harding was a known womanizer, and one of his long-term affairs was with a woman who was 30 years his junior, by whom he had a daughter. When his mistress, his lover, was pregnant, President Harding rented a room for her in Asbury Park, and that was where his daughter was born. Harding died in office, and his estate refused to acknowledge his paternity of this child, and his young lover wrote a book, and we have a first edition copy of that book on display, called The President's Daughter. And not unlike Grant, who wrote his memoir in order to support his family, the woman who wrote this book, Nan Britton, wrote it not so much to embarrass the president, whom she genuinely loved, but to support her daughter and herself after the president's death. As long as he was alive, he was providing for her, but she was again facing destitution after he was gone. The radio is here because the first commercial radio license was issued in the United States in Pittsburgh in 1920. 1920 was the year that Warren Harding became president. So Warren Harding's voice was the first U.S. president to be heard over the radio, which means it was the first time that most of the population of the country had an opportunity to hear firsthand what our president sounded like. He was also the first president to be elected when women could have the vote. The women received the vote in 1920, and he was elected and became president in 1920. I'm confident that at least several of the presidents we've talked about who vacationed in Long Branch made their way to Asbury Park. I know that Hayes ordered the plates that he had made for the White House from a designer who had a shop in Asbury Park. But because we've covered them in Long Branch, we're not covering them again in Asbury Park. But we do add Barack Obama, because President Obama was here in May of 2013. He appeared on the Asbury Park Boardwalk with Governor Christie, and he was here to give us encouragement and pledge the support of the federal government in our recovery from Hurricane Sandy. We're working our way south. We've traveled through Long Branch and Asbury Park, and we're working our way down to Ocean Grove. Ocean Grove was also a wonderful vacation spot, attractive to a lot of vacationing dignitaries, including some presidents. Most of all, we have evidence of at least seven presidents who spoke there in the famous Ocean Grove Auditorium, and the precursor to the Ocean Grove Auditorium, also a large building for public speaking and for shows. Grant spoke there frequently. We know that his last public appearance was at the Ocean Grove, the precursor to the Ocean Grove Auditorium. It was while he was suffering near death with his throat cancer. It was after his public humiliation in the collapse of his financial firm. He was there to talk to a reunion of Civil War Union Army chaplains, and he was very nervous about the kind of reception he would get given the publicity around the financial scandal. And when he got there, he was warmly and graciously received with a standing ovation by the chaplains, and he was so moved that he never did speak, but he was on the stage to acknowledge the love and the respect of those Civil War vets. There's also a wonderful story about President Grant, visiting Ocean Grove. I believe his sister lived there. I don't know whether she rented or owned a home there. But Grant was alleged to have come on a Sunday in his horse and buggy, and in those days, Ocean Grove had a blue law that prevented any vehicles from being on any of the streets of Ocean Grove from midnight Saturday night till midnight Sunday night. So they heard that the president was about to arrive and greeted him at the gates and said, "Mr. President, for you, we will make an exception." And the president said, "No, for me, you will not make an exception. I will abide by the laws." And he got off and walked to his sister's cottage. So whether or not that's true, that's a story that's being told in Ocean Grove for generations. We move on to south, again moving south from Ocean Grove to Seagirt. I mentioned that we had the National Guard campgrounds in Seagirt, where President Wilson received news of his nomination to his first term. So we know that President Wilson was a vacationer there. We also know that Teddy Roosevelt came. He came to inspect the troops. And my favorite story of Seagirt is the one of the other Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, who kicked off his first campaign for his first term as president from Seagirt. And this is why that happened. Frank Hague, who was the Democratic mayor of Jersey City, had promised FDR that if he would launch his presidential campaign from New Jersey, Hague would promise him the largest political rally ever in the history of the country. So FDR did, and Frank Hague did. And Hague rented railroad cars, he rented buses. It was during the Depression. He gave everyone who showed up a dime and a box lunch, and allegedly 100,000 people showed up at the Seagirt campgrounds. And it served Frank Hague well, because Roosevelt never forgot that Hague had that kind of clout to pull off such an event. And FDR was loyal to him, and Jersey City benefited from more than one WPA project. Later on, Nixon came. I'm sorry, Nixon came back. I want to take you back to Ocean Grove to wrap up and just point out that Nixon gave a campaign speech there at a midterm election in 1970. So that's kind of the story of the 13 presidents that we counted originally in our exhibit, and I wanted to share it with you before it comes down. So I hope you've enjoyed your guided tour.